The radio crackled with static as Lieutenant Sarah Chen's hands gripped the controls of her F-16 Fighting Falcon. Below her, the desert stretched endlessly under the blazing sun. What started as a routine patrol mission was about to become the most extraordinary aerial combat in modern military history. Command, this is Eagle 1. I count 8 hostile aircraft approaching from the northeast. They're flying in perfect formation, just like the intelligence reports said they would. The voice on the other end was calm, but carried an edge of concern. Eagle 1, you are ordered to maintain distance. Those pilots have never been defeated. Repeat, maintain safe distance and await backup. Sarah looked at her fuel gauge. Backup was 30 minutes away. The enemy formation was closing in on a refugee convoy, carrying thousands of innocent civilians. In 30 minutes, those people would be dead. She took a deep breath and switched off her radio. What happened next would rewrite the rules of aerial warfare forever and prove that sometimes the impossible is just waiting for the right person to attempt it. Sarah Chun was 7 years old when she first saw a fighter jet streak across the sky above her grandmother's farm in rural Texas. The sound was like thunder, but instead of bringing rain, it brought dreams. She dropped the basket of eggs she was collecting and stood frozen in the middle of the chicken coop, watching the silver aircraft disappear into the clouds. Her grandmother found her there an hour later, still staring at the empty sky. "What's got you so mesmerized, little bird?" the elderly woman asked, using the nickname she'd given Sarah since birth. "I'm going to fly one of those someday, Grandma," Sarah said with the absolute certainty that only children possess. Her grandmother smiled and nodded, not knowing that this moment would shape the next 20 years of her granddaughter's life. Sarah's parents were practical people. Her father worked at the local hardware store, and her mother taught 3rd grade at the elementary school. They encouraged their daughter's interest in airplanes the way most parents encourage a child's fascination with dinosaurs or princesses, as a phase that would eventually pass. They bought her model planes for Christmas and birthdays, took her to air shows when they came to nearby cities, and nodded politely when she announced her career plans at family dinners. But Sarah's fascination never faded. While other children played with dolls or video games, she spent hours in the local library reading everything she could find about aviation. She learned about the Wright brothers, Amelia Earhart, and the Tuskegee Airmen. She memorized the specifications of different aircraft and could identify planes by their silhouettes alone. Her bedroom walls were covered with posters of military aircraft, and she had a detailed map of the world marked with the locations of famous air battles throughout history. She read biographies of famous pilots until the pages fell apart, then carefully taped them back together so she could read them again. When Sarah entered high school, her guidance counselor suggested she consider more realistic career options. The military, the counselor explained, was no place for someone like her. She was too small, too quiet, and, frankly, too female for the demanding world of combat aviation. The counselor recommended nursing or teaching instead. Sarah listened politely to this advice, then went home and researched every female pilot she could find. She discovered stories of women who had broken barriers, fought discrimination, and proven that skill in the cockpit had nothing to do with gender. These women became her heroes, and their stories fueled her determination. Her parents began to realize their daughter's dream wasn't going away when she announced she was joining the Civil Air Patrol, a volunteer organization that provided emergency services and promoted aviation education. At 15, Sarah was one of the youngest members of her local squadron, but she quickly distinguished herself with her knowledge and dedication. She spent every weekend at the small municipal airport, washing planes, cleaning hangars, and listening to the older pilots tell stories of their flying experiences. The airport manager, a retired Air Force colonel named James Rodriguez, took notice of the serious teenager who seemed to absorb every word about aviation like a sponge. Colonel Rodriguez had seen many young people come through the Civil Air Patrol over the years. Most were there for the uniform or the excitement, and most lost interest when they discovered how much work was involved in actually learning to fly. But Sarah was different. She arrived early for every meeting, stayed late to help with maintenance, and asked questions that showed she had been studying aviation manuals in her spare time. One autumn afternoon, As Sarah was helping to refuel a small Cessna, Colonel Rodriguez approached her with an offer that would change her life. "How would you feel about taking some flying lessons?" he asked. "I've got some connections, and I think we can work out a deal where you can earn flight time in exchange for work around here." Sarah's eyes widened with excitement, but she quickly composed herself. She had learned to control her emotions, understanding that in the world of aviation, being taken seriously meant presenting herself as calm and professional at all times. Her first flying lesson took place on a crisp October morning. The instructor, a patient woman named Linda Walsh who had been flying for 30 years, helped Sarah into the pilot's seat of a small training aircraft. As they taxied toward the runway, Linda explained the basic controls and safety procedures. But when they lifted off the ground, all the technical knowledge in the world couldn't have prepared Sarah for the feeling of actually flying. The earth fell away below them, and suddenly, she was seeing the world from a completely new perspective. The farms and roads that had defined her entire existence looked like toys spread out on a vast table. She felt a sense of freedom and possibility that she had never experienced before. Linda watched her student carefully during that first flight. She had taught hundreds of people to fly over the years, and she could usually tell within the first few minutes whether someone had natural ability or would need to work harder to develop their skills. Sarah, she realized immediately, was a natural. The teenager's hands on the controls were steady and confident. She listened to instructions carefully, processed them quickly, and executed them smoothly. Most importantly, she seemed to understand instinctively how the aircraft responded to her inputs. It was as if she had been born to fly. Over the following months, Sarah spent every free moment at the airport. She earned her private pilot's license at 17, younger than most people could even begin training. She continued working odd jobs around the airport to pay for flight time, washing planes, fueling aircraft, and helping with maintenance. The other pilots began to respect her not just for her enthusiasm, but for her growing skill and knowledge. Colonel Rodriguez watched Sarah's progress with increasing interest. He had served 25 years in the Air Force and had commanded fighter squadrons during his career. He recognized exceptional talent when he saw it, and he knew Sarah had the potential to be more than just a recreational pilot. During her senior year of high school, he sat down with her to discuss her future plans. Sarah had already been accepted to several colleges with aerospace engineering programs, but she confessed that what she really wanted was to become a military pilot. The problem was that her grades, while good, weren't exceptional, and she wasn't sure she could compete with candidates from military academies or elite universities. Colonel Rodriguez smiled and pulled out a business card. "I want you to meet someone," he said. The card belonged to a recruiter from the Air Force Academy. "I've already told him about you. He's coming to visit next week specifically to meet with you." Sarah's heart raced, but she kept her expression calm. She had learned that in the world of aviation, showing too much emotion was often seen as a sign of weakness or lack of control. But, inside, she felt like that 7-year-old girl standing in the chicken coop, watching a fighter jet disappear into the clouds. The meeting with the Air Force Academy recruiter went better than Sarah had dared to hope. Her flying experience, combined with her dedication and knowledge of aviation, impressed him immediately. He explained that while her academic scores were competitive, what really set her apart was her obvious passion and practical experience. The application process for the Air Force Academy was grueling. Sarah had to pass physical fitness tests, medical examinations, and extensive interviews. She wrote essay after essay about her goals and motivations. She had to get recommendations from teachers, coaches, and community leaders. The United States Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs was unlike anything Sarah had ever experienced. The massive stone buildings seemed to rise from the mountains themselves, and everywhere she looked, she saw cadets in crisp blue uniforms moving with purpose and precision. This was no longer the small-town airport where everyone knew her name and supported her dreams. This was a place where she would have to prove herself every single day. Sarah's roommate was Jennifer Martinez, a tall, confident young woman from California whose father was a retired Navy admiral. Jennifer had grown up on military bases around the world and seemed completely comfortable with the Academy's demanding environment. She spoke casually about military protocol and terminology that Sarah was still learning, making Sarah feel like an outsider from the very first day. The academic workload was intense. Sarah found herself studying subjects she had never encountered before: military history, leadership theory, advanced mathematics, and physics. The professors were demanding, and the pace was relentless. Many of her classmates had attended elite preparatory schools where they had already been exposed to college-level material. Sarah felt like she was running to catch up with a train that was already moving at full speed. But it was the flight training program that really tested her resolve. The Academy's aviation program was designed to identify future pilots from among the cadets, and the competition was fierce. Every cadet who dreamed of flying was pushing themselves to be the best, and the instructors were looking for any excuse to eliminate candidates who couldn't handle the pressure. Sarah's first flight instructor at the Academy was Captain Michael Torres, a former F-16 pilot who had flown combat missions in 3 different conflicts. He had a reputation for being tough but fair, and he didn't believe in giving anyone special treatment. During their first meeting, he looked at Sarah's file and raised an eyebrow. "So you're the farm girl from Texas who thinks she can fly fighters," he said. "It wasn't a question. I see you've got some civilian flight experience. That's nice, but this isn't the county fair. We're going to find out real quick if you've got what it takes to handle military aircraft." Their first flight together was an AT-6 Texan II, the Academy's primary training aircraft. Sarah had studied the aircraft's specifications and procedures for weeks, but nothing had prepared her for the difference between civilian and military flying. The training flights were more aggressive, with steeper climbs, tighter turns, and more demanding maneuvers than anything she had experienced before. Captain Torres pushed her hard from the very beginning. He would call out emergency scenarios without warning, requiring her to respond quickly and correctly. Engine failures, electrical problems, navigation system malfunctions. He threw everything he could think of at her to test her ability to think and react under pressure. Sarah discovered that her civilian flight experience was both an asset and a liability. On one hand, she was comfortable with basic aircraft control and had good intuitive flying skills. On the other hand, she had developed some habits that weren't suitable for military aviation. Captain Torres spent considerable time breaking her of these civilian habits and rebuilding her techniques from the ground up. The physical demands of military flight training were something Sarah had not fully anticipated. The G-forces generated during aerobatic maneuvers were intense, and many cadets struggled with air sickness or disorientation. Sarah discovered that her small stature, which some had seen as a disadvantage, actually helped her tolerate the physical stresses of high-performance flight better than many of her larger classmates. But the real challenge wasn't physical, it was psychological. The military flight training environment was designed to create pressure and stress. Instructors would criticize performance harshly, pointing out every minor error and demanding immediate improvement. Some cadets thrived under this pressure, while others cracked under the constant scrutiny. Sarah found herself somewhere in the middle. The criticism stung, especially when it felt unfair or overly harsh. But she had learned during her years at the small-town airport that aviation demanded perfection. A small mistake in an airplane could have serious consequences, and she understood that the instructor's demands for excellence weren't personal, they were necessary. Her breakthrough moment came during her 4th week of training. Captain Torres had been particularly critical of her formation flying, pointing out that she was too cautious and not maintaining proper position relative to the lead aircraft. Formation flying required a level of precision and aggression that was completely different from solo flight, and Sarah was struggling to find the right balance. During one training flight, they were practicing a complex formation maneuver when the lead aircraft encountered a mechanical problem and had to make an emergency descent. Sarah found herself temporarily leading the formation, and she had to make split-second decisions about how to safely guide the other aircraft away from the emergency situation. Without thinking, she took command of the radio and began issuing clear, calm instructions to the other pilots. She positioned her aircraft to provide a safe path for the troubled plane to descend, then reorganized the remaining formation to continue the training mission. The entire sequence lasted less than 3 minutes, but it demonstrated exactly the kind of leadership and flying skill the instructors were looking for. After they landed, Captain Torres pulled Sarah aside for what she expected would be another criticism session. Instead, he looked at her with something that might have been respect. "That was good flying, Chun," he said. "You kept your head when things went wrong, and you took care of your wingmen. That's what we're looking for." From that point forward, Sarah's confidence began to grow. She started to understand that military flying wasn't just about individual skill. It was about being part of a team where everyone depended on everyone else. The competitive atmosphere began to make more sense when she realized that the goal wasn't to beat her classmates, but to ensure that everyone who graduated would be capable of handling life-or-death situations. Her academic performance improved as well. She discovered that her practical flying experience helped her understand theoretical concepts that some of her classmates found abstract. When they studied aerodynamics or aircraft systems, she could relate the material to actual flying experience, which made it easier to remember and apply. Sarah also began to find her place in the social environment of the academy. Her quiet, serious demeanor, which had sometimes made her seem standoffish, began to be seen as focused professionalism. Other cadets started coming to her for help with flight-related coursework, and she found that explaining concepts to others actually helped her understand them better herself. The turning point in her academy experience came during her second year, when cadets were allowed to begin training in more advanced aircraft. Sarah was selected for the T-38 Talon program, which was a prerequisite for future fighter pilot training. The T-38 was a supersonic jet trainer, and flying it represented a major step toward her goal of becoming a combat pilot. Her first flight in the T-38 was everything she had dreamed about since childhood. The aircraft was faster and more responsive than anything she had ever flown. When they broke the sound barrier for the first time, Sarah felt a rush of excitement that reminded her why she had wanted to become a pilot in the first place. But the T-38 program also brought new challenges. The training scenarios were more complex, the performance standards were higher, and the consequences of mistakes were more serious. Some cadets who had excelled in earlier programs found themselves struggling with the increased demands. Sarah discovered that she had a natural talent for high-speed, high-stress flying. The faster and more challenging the mission became, the more focused and capable she seemed to become. Her instructors began to notice that she performed her best when the stakes were highest and the pressure was most intense. During one particularly demanding training mission, Sarah and her flight instructor were practicing air-to-air combat maneuvers when they encountered actual military aircraft conducting training exercises in the same airspace. It was an unplanned encounter, but the instructor decided to turn it into an impromptu lesson in real-world tactical flying. Sarah found herself engaged in a mock dogfight with an experienced F-16 pilot who was known throughout the Air Force for his aerial combat skills. The engagement lasted only a few minutes, but in that time, Sarah demonstrated an intuitive understanding of aerial tactics that surprised everyone involved, including herself. She seemed to anticipate her opponent's moves before he Luke Air Force Base in Arizona felt like stepping into a furnace, even at 6 in the morning. The desert heat shimmered off the runway as Second Lieutenant Sarah Chun walked toward the F-16 Fighting Falcon that would be her training aircraft for the next 18 months. The sleek fighter looked exactly like the model she had built as a child, but, standing next to the real thing, she was struck by how much larger and more imposing it appeared. Her F-16 instructor pilot was Major David Viper Sullivan, a combat veteran with over 2,000 hours in the Fighting Falcon and 3 confirmed air-to-air victories from previous deployments. He had a reputation for being one of the best instructors in the Air Force, but also one of the most demanding. Pilots who trained under Major Sullivan either became exceptional fighter pilots or washed out of the program entirely. "Chun," Major Sullivan said as she approached the aircraft, "I've read your academy file. Impressive stuff. But forget everything you think you know about flying. We're starting from zero today. The F-16 is unlike anything you've ever experienced, and if you approach it with overconfidence, it will humble you very quickly." Sarah nodded, keeping her expression neutral. She had learned at the academy that overconfidence was one of the fastest ways to fail in military aviation. The F-16 was a single-seat, single-engine fighter capable of pulling 9 gs and flying at twice the speed of sound. It was a machine that demanded absolute respect. Her first flight in the F-16 was a revelation. The aircraft's power was overwhelming. When Major Sullivan advanced the throttle for takeoff, Sarah felt pressed back into her seat with a force she had never experienced. Within seconds, they were climbing at an angle that seemed impossible, the ground falling away so rapidly that it took her breath away. But it was when Major Sullivan demonstrated the aircraft's maneuverability that Sarah truly understood what she was dealing with. The F-16 could change direction so quickly and dramatically that it seemed to defy the laws of physics. The G-forces generated during high-speed turns were crushing, and Sarah found herself struggling to maintain consciousness during some maneuvers. "The jet will do things your body can't handle," Major Sullivan explained over the intercom. Learning to fly the F-16 isn't just about aircraft control. It's about pushing yourself to the absolute limits of human endurance. The training program was grueling. Sarah flew twice a day, 6 days a week, in increasingly complex scenarios. She learned air-to-air combat, air-to-ground attack missions, electronic warfare, and low-level penetration flights. Each type of mission required different skills and techniques, and mastering them all seemed almost impossible. The academic portion of the training was equally demanding. Sarah studied radar systems, weapons employment, threat recognition, and tactical procedures. She memorized the capabilities and limitations of enemy aircraft and surface-to-air missile systems. She learned to think like a combat pilot, always analyzing situations for potential threats and opportunities. But the most challenging aspect of F-16 training wasn't technical. It was learning to make life-or-death decisions in milliseconds while pulling multiple GS and traveling at hundreds of miles per hour. The human brain wasn't designed to process information and make complex decisions under such extreme conditions, and many promising pilots discovered they couldn't handle the mental demands of fighter combat. Sarah found that her small stature, which some had questioned during her academy years, was actually an advantage in the F-16. She could tolerate higher G-forces than many of her larger classmates, and the aircraft's controls were easier for her to reach and operate effectively. But, more importantly, she discovered that she had an almost supernatural ability to remain calm and focused under extreme pressure. During one training mission, Sarah and her instructor were practicing air-to-air combat when they encountered a real emergency. A civilian aircraft had suffered an engine failure and was making an emergency descent through military training airspace without radio contact. Sarah and Major Sullivan found themselves in the position of providing emergency assistance to the troubled aircraft. Without hesitation, Sarah took the lead in establishing radio contact with the civilian pilot and guiding him toward the nearest suitable airport. She had to quickly calculate wind conditions, fuel remaining, and optimal glide paths while simultaneously coordinating with air traffic control and ensuring the safety of other aircraft in the area. The entire emergency lasted only 12 minutes, but Sarah's performance during those critical moments impressed Major Sullivan more than any routine training mission could have. She had demonstrated exactly the kind of quick thinking and leadership ability that made exceptional fighter pilots. "That was textbook emergency response," Major Sullivan told her after they landed. "You kept your head, you took charge of the situation, and you got everyone safely on the ground. That's the mark of a natural pilot." As her training progressed, Sarah began to excel in areas that challenged many of her classmates. She had a particular talent for air-to-air combat, demonstrating an intuitive understanding of three-dimensional aerial tactics that couldn't be taught from textbooks. During mock dogfights, she consistently outperformed pilots with more experience, using creative tactics and unpredictable maneuvers to gain advantages over her opponents. Her weapons training scores were equally impressive. The F-16 carried a variety of air-to-air and air-to-ground weapons, and each required precise employment techniques to be effective. Sarah seemed to have a natural feel for weapons employment, consistently achieving high accuracy scores even in challenging conditions. But it was during a large-scale training exercise called Red Flag that Sarah truly distinguished herself as an exceptional pilot. Red Flag was the Air Force's premier air combat training exercise, conducted at Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada. It brought together pilots from around the world to practice large-scale air combat scenarios as realistically as possible. Sarah was one of only 3 F-16 trainees selected to participate in the exercise, and she would be flying against some of the most experienced combat pilots in the world. The scenarios were designed to simulate real combat conditions, with enemy aircraft played by aggressor squadrons trained to employ actual threat country tactics and techniques. On her first red flag mission, Sarah found herself part of a large formation tasked with gaining air superiority over a heavily defended target area. The opposition force included experienced pilots flying aircraft that simulated advanced enemy fighters, supported by simulated surface-to-air missile systems and electronic warfare platforms. The mission began at dawn, with Sarah's formation approaching the target area at low altitude to avoid radar detection. As they climbed to engage the enemy fighters, Sarah found herself separated from the main formation and facing 3 enemy aircraft simultaneously. What happened next became legendary among the pilots participating in the exercise. Instead of calling for help or trying to escape, Sarah engaged all 3 opponents simultaneously, using vertical maneuvers and creative tactics to prevent them from coordinating their attacks. In the span of 4 minutes, she achieved simulated kills against all 3 aircraft while avoiding being shot down herself. The performance was so impressive that the exercise controllers initially thought there had been a mistake in the simulation systems. When they reviewed the data, they discovered that Sarah had employed tactics that were both unconventional and highly effective, demonstrating a level of situational awareness and tactical thinking that was remarkable for a trainee. Word of Sarah's performance spread quickly through the fighter pilot community. Experienced combat veterans began seeking her out to discuss her tactics and techniques. She found herself invited to briefings and debriefings normally reserved for senior pilots, and instructors began using her flights as examples of exceptional performance. But the attention also brought increased pressure and expectations. Sarah was no longer just another trainee. She was being watched by senior officers who were already thinking about her future assignments and potential for leadership roles in combat units. During her final months of F-16 training, Sarah was selected for advanced tactical training programs that were normally reserved for pilots with years of operational experience. She learned about classified weapons systems, studied intelligence reports on potential adversaries, and practiced scenarios based on actual combat situations. Her final check ride was conducted by Colonel Patricia Hawk Johnson, the wing commander and a combat veteran with over 3,000 hours in fighter aircraft. Colonel Johnson had personally flown some of the most dangerous missions of the past decade, and her standards were impossibly high. The check ride lasted 3 hours and included every type of mission Sarah might encounter as an operational pilot. Air-to-air combat, ground attack, emergency procedures, and navigation challenges. Colonel Johnson tested every skill Sarah had learned during her training. When they landed, Colonel Johnson's evaluation was brief but comprehensive. "Chun, in 30 years of flying fighters, I've rarely seen a pilot with your natural ability and tactical thinking. You have the potential to be an exceptional combat pilot, but remember that potential means nothing until it's tested in real situations." Sarah's assignment after graduation from F-16 training was to the 388th Fighter Wing at Hill Air Force Base in Utah, one of the Air Force's premier combat units. The squadron had recently returned from deployment and was preparing for another overseas assignment within the next year. Her new squadron commander was Lieutenant Colonel Mark Razor Thompson, a highly decorated pilot who had led combat missions in multiple theaters. During their first meeting, he made it clear that Sarah's training performance, while impressive, was just the beginning of her real education as a fighter pilot. "Training is designed to teach you not to kill yourself or your wingmen," he explained. "Combat flying is about accomplishing the mission regardless of what the enemy throws at you. The two are related, but completely different. Your real training starts now." Sarah's first months with the operational squadron were dedicated to mission qualification training. She learned about the specific aircraft her unit flew, the weapons they carried, and the types of missions they were expected to perform. She studied the unit's history, tactics, and procedures, and began flying with experienced pilots who had recent combat experience. The squadron's mission included both air-to-air and air-to-ground operations, and Sarah had to demonstrate proficiency in all areas before she could be declared combat-ready. The standards were even higher than those she had faced during training, and the consequences of failure were more serious. The deployment notification came on a Tuesday morning in March. Captain Sarah Chun, now 3 years into her operational flying career, was in the middle of a routine training mission briefing when her squadron commander pulled her aside. The expression on Lieutenant Colonel Thompson's face told her immediately that this wasn't going to be a normal conversation. "Pack your bags, Chun. We're deploying to Al Dhafra Air Base in the UAE within the week. The situation in the region has deteriorated rapidly, and they need experienced pilots on station immediately." Sarah nodded, keeping her expression professional despite the mixture of excitement and apprehension she felt. She had been training for deployment since joining the squadron, but the reality of actual combat operations was something entirely different from the simulations and exercises she had experienced. The flight to Al Dhafra took 14 hours, with multiple air-to-air refueling stops along the way. Sarah had never flown such a long distance in the F-16, and the experience gave her a new appreciation for the logistics involved in deploying fighter aircraft halfway around the world. By the time they arrived at the base, she was exhausted but exhilarated. Al Dhafra was unlike any military base Sarah had previously experienced. The heat was overwhelming, even in March, and everything was covered with a fine layer of sand that seemed to get into every piece of equipment. The base hosted aircraft from multiple countries, and the flight line was a constantly busy mixture of fighters, cargo aircraft, and support vehicles. Her first briefing at Al Dhafra was conducted by Colonel James Mitchell, the Air Expedition Commander, who had been deployed to the region for 8 months. He was a veteran of multiple combat deployments, and his briefing style was direct and uncompromising. "The threat environment here is complex and constantly changing," he explained to the newly arrived pilots. "We're dealing with sophisticated enemy air defenses, advanced fighter aircraft, and pilots who are experienced and well-trained. This isn't the training environment you're used to. Mistakes here have real consequences." Sarah learned that the regional conflict had been escalating for months, with multiple nations involved in a complex web of alliances and hostilities. Intelligence reports indicated that enemy forces had been conducting increasingly aggressive operations, and there were strong indicators that a major offensive was being planned. Her squadron's mission would include both defensive and offensive operations. They would provide air cover for friendly ground forces, conduct strikes against high-value targets, and maintain air superiority over critical areas. The operations tempo would be intense, with pilots flying multiple missions per day in challenging conditions. Sarah's first combat mission came just 4 days after her arrival. She was assigned as wingman to Major Lisa "Phoenix" Rodriguez, one of the squadron's most experienced combat pilots. The mission was a routine combat air patrol over a convoy route that had been experiencing increased enemy activity. As they took off into the pre-dawn darkness, Sarah felt a mixture of emotions she had never experienced before. This was what she had been training for since she was 7 years old, but the reality of potentially engaging enemy aircraft in actual combat was sobering. The academic knowledge and simulated scenarios of training suddenly felt very different when applied to a situation where people could actually die. The first few hours of the mission were uneventful. Sarah and Major Rodriguez flew protective circles over the convoy route, monitoring radio frequencies and watching for any signs of enemy activity. The desert below was empty and unchanging, and the heat haze made visibility challenging even at altitude. But as the sun rose higher, their radar began detecting aircraft operating in the distance. Intelligence had warned them that enemy fighters had been conducting aggressive reconnaissance flights in the area, testing response times, and gathering information about friendly force movements. "Eagle 1, this is command. We show multiple contacts bearing north-northeast of your position. Rules of engagement are weapons tight unless fired upon or clear hostile intent is observed." Sarah felt her heart rate increase as she watched the radar contacts moving across her display. These weren't training aircraft or civilian planes. they were potentially hostile fighters flown by pilots who might be trying to kill her. The theoretical knowledge of air-to-air combat suddenly became very practical and immediate. The enemy aircraft maintained their distance, but continued to probe the edges of the protected airspace. For 2 hours, Sarah and Major Rodriguez shadowed the hostile formation, ensuring they didn't threaten the convoy while gathering intelligence about their capabilities and intentions. The tension was unlike anything Sarah had experienced during training. Every radio call, every radar contact, every movement by the enemy aircraft had to be analyzed for potential threats. The mental workload was enormous, and she found herself completely focused on the tactical situation to the exclusion of everything else. When the mission ended without engagement, Sarah felt simultaneously relieved and disappointed. She had been prepared for combat, but had not experienced it. Major Rodriguez explained during the debrief that most combat missions ended this way: hours of tension and preparation punctuated by brief moments of actual action. Combat flying is 90% boredom and 10% terror, she told Sarah. The key is staying alert and prepared during the boring parts so you're ready when the terror starts. Over the following weeks, Sarah flew dozens of similar missions: combat air patrols, escort duties, and reconnaissance flights. Each one carried the potential for actual engagement, but most ended without shots being fired. She began to understand the psychological challenges of combat flying, where pilots had to maintain peak alertness for hours while knowing that a few seconds of inattention could be fatal. The operational tempo was intense. Pilots were flying twice a day, 6 days a week, with only brief rest periods between missions. The desert heat and constant stress began to take a physical toll, and several pilots had to be rotated out due to exhaustion or medical issues. Sarah discovered that she adapted well to the demanding schedule. Her years of training had prepared her physically and mentally for the challenges of combat operations. She consistently performed well during missions and demonstrated the kind of steady reliability that commanders valued in combat pilots. But it was during her 6th week of deployment that Sarah encountered the situation that would define her entire military career. Intelligence reports had identified a major enemy offensive being prepared in a remote desert region, and coalition forces were planning a preemptive strike to disrupt the operation. The target was a heavily defended enemy airfield that hosted some of the region's most advanced fighter aircraft. The mission would be the largest air operation conducted during the deployment, involving dozens of aircraft from multiple nations. Sarah was selected to participate based on her consistent performance during previous missions. The mission briefing took place in a secure conference room at Al Dhafra, with pilots from 4 different countries participating. The target was defended by sophisticated surface-to-air missile systems and was expected to be protected by enemy fighters that had never been defeated in combat. Sarah studied the intelligence reports with growing concern. The enemy pilots they would potentially face had training and experience comparable to her own, and they would be flying aircraft that were technically advanced and highly capable. This would not be the one-sided engagement that characterized many air operations. Colonel Mitchell personally briefed the mission participants on the rules of engagement and expected enemy responses. Intelligence indicates that the enemy is planning to deploy these aircraft against civilian targets within the next 48 hours, he explained. This mission is critical to preventing significant loss of innocent life. Sarah was assigned to the air-to-air portion of the mission, tasked with establishing air superiority while strike aircraft attacked ground targets. She would be flying as part of a 4-ship formation led by Major Rodriguez, and their specific responsibility was to engage any enemy fighters that attempted to interfere with the strike mission. The mission launched exactly as planned at 0630 hours. Captain Sarah Chen's F-16 lifted off from Al Dhafra Air Base as part of a massive formation that included 42 aircraft from 4 different nations. The pre-dawn sky was clear, and visibility was unlimited, perfect conditions for the largest air operation of the deployment. Sarah flew in the number 2 position behind Major Rodriguez, with 2 additional F-16s completing their 4-ship formation. Their call sign was Eagle Flight, and their mission was to establish air superiority over the target area while strike aircraft conducted attacks on the enemy airfield below. The flight to the target area took 90 minutes, with the formation maintaining radio silence and flying at low altitude to avoid enemy radar detection. Sarah monitored her instruments carefully, checking fuel consumption, engine parameters, and weapon systems. Everything was functioning perfectly, but she couldn't shake a feeling of unease that had been growing since takeoff. Intelligence reports had indicated that enemy fighters would likely respond to the attack, but the specific threat was unknown. The enemy pilots they might face had never been defeated in air-to-air combat, and their aircraft were among the most advanced in the world. Sarah knew that her training had prepared her as well as possible, but actual combat would be the ultimate test. As they approached the target area, Major Rodriguez began climbing to their assigned altitude of 25,000 feet. The formation spread out into combat spacing, with each aircraft positioned to provide mutual support while maintaining enough separation to avoid mid-air collisions during high-speed maneuvering. Eagle Flight, this is Overlord. We show multiple bandits launching from the target airfield. Count 8 aircraft, probably MiG-29s, climbing rapidly to intercept. Rules of engagement are weapons free for any aircraft showing hostile intent. Sarah felt her adrenaline surge as she processed the radio call. 8 enemy fighters against their 4-ship formation. Exactly the kind of scenario they had practiced countless times in training. But this time, the weapons were real, and the consequences of failure would be measured in human lives. The enemy formation appeared on Sarah's radar at a range of 60 miles, climbing aggressively toward the coalition aircraft. The MiG-29 was a formidable opponent, fast, maneuverable, and equipped with long-range missiles that could engage targets from beyond visual range. Eagle Flight, bandits bearing 090, 60 miles, and closing fast. Recommend we turn toward them and engage before they can threaten the strike package. Major Rodriguez's voice was calm and professional, but Sarah could hear the tension beneath the surface. This was the moment they had all been training for, actual air-to-air combat against experienced enemy pilots flying advanced aircraft. The engagement began at 40 miles when both formations launched missiles simultaneously. Sarah watched her radar display as multiple contacts appeared, tracking both enemy aircraft and the missiles they had fired. The tactical situation was complex and developing rapidly, requiring split-second decisions that could determine the outcome of the entire mission. Eagle 2, break left now. Major Rodriguez's voice cut through the radio chatter as enemy missiles closed on their formation. Sarah yanked her aircraft into a violent left turn, pulling nearly 8 gs as she tried to defeat the incoming missile. Chaff and flare dispensers fired automatically, filling the air around her aircraft with decoys designed to confuse enemy guidance systems. The first enemy missile passed harmlessly to her right, but Sarah could see that the enemy formation was closing rapidly. In less than 2 minutes, they would be in visual range, and the engagement would become a close-range dogfight where pilot skill and aircraft performance would determine the outcome. Eagle lead is hit. Eagle lead is hit. I'm losing hydraulics and electrical power. Eagle 2, you have the lead. Sarah's heart sank as she heard Major Rodriguez's emergency call. In an instant, she had gone from wingman to flight leader, responsible not only for her own survival, but for the success of the entire mission. 3 other pilots were now looking to her for leadership in the middle of a complex air battle. Eagle Flight, this is Eagle 2. I have the lead. Phoenix, can you make it back to base? Negative, Eagle 2. I'm going down. Good hunting. Sarah watched in horror as Major Rodriguez's aircraft disappeared from her radar display. Her friend and mentor was gone, and there was no time to process the loss or grieve. 8 enemy fighters were less than 20 miles away and closing fast, and the strike aircraft they were supposed to protect were counting on her to clear the skies. Eagle 3 and 4 continue as briefed. I'm taking the initial engagement. What Sarah did next would be analyzed and studied by military tacticians for years to come. Instead of waiting for the enemy formation to close, she turned directly toward them and accelerated to maximum speed. Her plan was to disrupt their formation and create chaos before they could coordinate their attacks. The first enemy fighter appeared in her windscreen at a range of 8 miles, approaching head-on at a combined closure rate of over 1,200 miles per hour. Sarah fired a long-range missile and immediately turned to avoid the enemy pilot's return fire. Her missile found its target, and the first enemy aircraft disappeared in a ball of flame and smoke. But 7 enemy fighters remained, and they were now fully committed to the engagement. Sarah found herself alone against impossible odds, with friendly aircraft too far away to provide immediate assistance. The next few minutes would test every skill she had learned and push her abilities beyond anything she had previously experienced. The second enemy aircraft tried to engage her from the left side, but Sarah had anticipated the maneuver. She pulled her F-16 into a vertical climb, then rolled inverted and dove back toward the enemy formation. The unexpected maneuver confused the enemy pilots and allowed her to position herself for another missile shot. Her second kill came 30 seconds after the first, but the remaining enemy fighters were learning to adapt to her unconventional tactics. They began splitting up, trying to attack her from multiple directions simultaneously. Sarah found herself flying through a three-dimensional maze of enemy aircraft, all trying to achieve firing position on her lone F-16. The physical demands of the engagement were enormous. Sarah was pulling sustained G-forces that pushed her to the limits of human endurance, while simultaneously monitoring multiple threats, managing her aircraft systems, and making tactical decisions that had to be both correct and instantaneous. Her third kill came during a high-speed diving attack that took her from 25,000 feet to 5,000 feet in less than 60 seconds. She had rolled in behind an enemy fighter that was pursuing one of her wingmen, and her missile struck the target just as it was about to fire on the friendly aircraft. But the aggressive maneuver had left Sarah in a vulnerable position, with enemy fighters closing from multiple directions. She found herself flying at low altitude with limited maneuvering room and insufficient airspeed to effectively evade the multiple threats converging on her position. What happened next demonstrated the kind of split-second decision-making that separated exceptional pilots from merely competent ones. Instead of trying to run or climb away from the threats, Sarah turned directly into the center of the enemy formation and accelerated to maximum afterburner. The maneuver was so unexpected and aggressive that it completely disrupted the enemy pilots' coordination. They found themselves forced to break off their attacks to avoid collision, and several of them nearly engaged each other instead of Sarah's aircraft. In the confusion that followed, Sarah achieved 3 more missile kills in rapid succession. Her unconventional tactics and aggressive flying had turned what should have been a hopeless situation into a series of individual engagements that she could win through superior skill and preparation. The 7th enemy fighter attempted a desperate head-on attack, probably hoping to take Sarah with him in a mutual destruction scenario. But Sarah had been anticipating such a move, and she defeated the attack with a last-second defensive maneuver that left the enemy pilot exposed to her final missile. The 8th and final enemy fighter tried to escape the engagement, probably hoping to disengage and report the disaster to his commanders. But Sarah's F-16 was faster and more maneuverable, and she caught the fleeing aircraft just as it reached the edge of the engagement area. When the last enemy fighter fell from the sky, Sarah found herself alone in airspace that had been filled with aircraft and missiles just minutes before. The entire engagement had lasted less than 8 minutes. But in that brief time, she had achieved something that military historians would later call unprecedented. Eagle 2, this is Overlord. We show the airspace clear of hostiles. Confirm your status. Overlord, this is Eagle 2. All bandits are down. Repeat, all bandits are down. Airspace is clear for the strike package. The radio silence that followed her transmission lasted several seconds, as controllers and pilots throughout the operation processed what they had just witnessed. A single pilot had engaged 8 enemy fighters simultaneously and emerged victorious without losing a single friendly aircraft. The strike mission proceeded as planned, with the enemy airfield completely neutralized and all coalition aircraft returning safely to base. But the story that dominated the post-mission briefings wasn't the successful ground attack. It was Sarah's unprecedented air-to-air engagement. Colonel Mitchell personally debriefed Sarah after the mission, studying the tactical data and trying to understand how she had accomplished something that military experts had considered impossible. Her gun camera footage showed a series of engagements that demonstrated tactical thinking and flying skill at the highest possible level. Chun, in 30 years of military service, I've never seen anything like what you did today. You saved the entire strike package and accomplished a mission that we thought would require at least 12 aircraft to complete. How did you know it would work? Sarah thought about the question for several minutes before responding. She realized that she couldn't explain her tactical decisions in purely analytical terms. Much of what she had done had been based on intuition and split-second reactions that drew on years of training and experience. Sir, I don't think I knew it would work. But I knew that if I didn't try something aggressive and unexpected, we were going to lose aircraft and possibly the entire mission. Sometimes you have to take calculated risks when the alternative is certain failure. Word of Sarah's achievement spread rapidly through the military aviation community. Her engagement was studied at service academies and fighter weapons schools as an example of exceptional tactical thinking under extreme pressure. She received commendations from senior officers in multiple nations and was recommended for some of the highest decorations available to military pilots. But, for Sarah, the most meaningful recognition came from the other pilots in her squadron. They understood better than anyone the skill and courage required to achieve what she had accomplished, and their respect meant more to her than any official recognition. The deployment continued for several more months, but enemy air activity decreased significantly after the loss of their most experienced pilots. Sarah flew dozens of additional missions, but none approached the intensity of that 8-minute engagement that had changed the course of the entire operation. When she finally returned to the United States, Sarah found that her life had been transformed by those 8 minutes over the desert. She was no longer just another Air Force pilot. She was a combat veteran who had proven herself in the ultimate test of aerial warfare. But as she stood on the flight line at Hill Air Force Base, watching the Utah mountains in the distance, Sarah thought about the friends and mentors who hadn't made it home. Major Rodriguez and others had paid the ultimate price for their service, and their sacrifice would never be forgotten. The little girl who had watched a fighter jet disappear into the Texas sky had become the pilot everyone said was unbeatable. But Sarah understood that victory in combat wasn't about individual achievement. It was about the dedication and sacrifice of countless people who had contributed to her success. She had proven that the impossible was just another mission waiting for the right pilot to attempt it. But, more importantly, she had honored the trust placed in her by a nation that had given her the opportunity to pursue her dreams and use them in service to others. The war was over, but Sarah's story was just beginning. The pilot who had taken down 8 enemy jets alone would continue to serve, to lead, and to inspire future generations of aviators who dared to dream of touching the sky. The night before the mission, Sarah found herself unable to sleep despite her exhaustion. She reviewed her aircraft systems, weapons employment procedures, and tactical plans repeatedly. She thought about her training, her preparation, and all the people who had helped her reach this point in her career. But, mostly, she thought about the responsibility she carried. Other pilots, ground crews, and potentially thousands of civilian lives depended on her ability to perform effectively during the mission. The stakes were higher than anything she had previously faced, and failure was not an option. As she finally drifted off to sleep in the early morning hours, Sarah's dreams were filled with images of aerial combat, radar screens, and the faces of the instructors who had taught her to fly. She had no way of knowing that in less than 24 hours, she would face a situation that would test every skill she had ever learned and push her abilities beyond anything she had previously imagined possible. The mission brief was scheduled for 0400 hours, with takeoff planned for dawn. Sarah woke before her alarm and spent an hour reviewing her mission materials one final time. As she walked toward the briefing room in the pre-dawn darkness, she could hear aircraft engines starting on the flight line. The largest air operation of the deployment was about to begin. She thought about the 7-year-old girl who had watched a fighter jet disappear into the clouds above a Texas farm. That little girl had dreamed of flying, but she could never have imagined the weight of responsibility that came with turning those dreams into reality. Today, Sarah would discover whether all her training and preparation had truly prepared her for the ultimate test of a combat pilot. The briefing room was filled with some of the most experienced military aviators in the world, but Sarah felt ready to take her place among them. Her journey from small-town dreamer to combat pilot was about to face its greatest challenge, and she was determined not to let down the people who had believed in her along the way. During one mission qualification flight, Sarah was practicing close air support procedures when her flight received an actual emergency call. A search and rescue helicopter had gone down in mountainous terrain, and fighter aircraft were needed to provide cover while rescue teams attempted to reach the crew. Sarah found herself flying her first real-world mission just 6 months after completing training. The situation was complex and dangerous. The helicopter had crashed in hostile territory, enemy forces were known to be in the area, and weather conditions were deteriorating rapidly. For 4 hours, Sarah and her wingmen flew protective circles over the crash site while rescue teams worked to extract the helicopter crew. They had to navigate through difficult terrain, monitor multiple radio frequencies, and remain alert for potential threats while managing fuel consumption and weather challenges. When the mission was successfully completed and the helicopter crew was safely recovered, Sarah realized that everything she had learned during years of training had been preparation for moments like this. Real combat flying wasn't about individual performance or competition with other pilots. It was about using her skills to protect people and accomplish missions that mattered. As she taxied back to the parking area after the mission, Sarah thought about the journey that had brought her to this point. From a small-town airport in Texas to one of the Air Force's elite fighter squadrons, every challenge and every lesson had been leading toward this moment when her training became real and her skills could make a difference in the lives of others. But she also understood that this was still just the beginning. Combat flying would test her in ways that no training program could simulate, and the decisions she made in the cockpit would have consequences that extended far beyond her own survival. She was ready for those challenges, but she had no idea how soon they would come or how dramatically they would change her understanding of what it meant to be a fighter pilot. Made them, positioning her aircraft to counter his attacks and create opportunities for her own. When the engagement ended, the F-16 pilot requested her name and made a note to remember it for future reference. Word of Sarah's performance began to spread among the flight instructors. She was developing a reputation as a cadet with exceptional potential, someone who might be capable of achieving great things as a combat pilot. This recognition brought new opportunities, but it also brought increased expectations and pressure. During her final year at the academy, Sarah was selected for advanced tactical training programs that were normally reserved for the top 5% of cadets. She learned about air-to-air combat, ground attack missions, and complex tactical scenarios. She studied the history of aerial warfare and analyzed famous air battles to understand the strategies and techniques that had proven successful in actual combat. As graduation approached, Sarah faced the most important decision of her military career: what type of aircraft she would fly as an Air Force officer. Her performance and test scores qualified her for any aircraft in the Air Force inventory, including the most prestigious fighter assignments. The night before graduation, Sarah stood on the Academy's parade ground and looked up at the stars above the Colorado mountains. In a few hours, she would receive her commission as a second lieutenant in the United States Air Force. All the studying, training, and pressure of the past 4 years had led to this moment. She thought about her grandmother's farm in Texas, where a 7-year-old girl had watched a fighter jet disappear into the clouds. That little girl could never have imagined the journey that lay ahead, the challenges she would face, or the person she would become. Tomorrow, she would begin the next phase of her training, learning to fly the aircraft that would define her military career. She had requested assignment to F-16 fighter training, and her request had been approved. Soon, she would be flying the same type of aircraft that had inspired her childhood dreams. But Sarah understood now that becoming a pilot was only the beginning. The real test would come when she had to use her skills in actual combat situations, where the consequences of success or failure would be measured in human lives. She was ready for that challenge, but she couldn't have imagined how soon she would face it, or how dramatically it would change her life forever. But the most challenging part of the process was the waiting. After submitting her application, Sarah had to continue with her normal life while knowing that her entire future hung in the balance. She continued working at the airport, studying for her regular high school classes, and building flight time whenever possible. The acceptance letter arrived on a Tuesday in March, just as Sarah was finishing her shift at the airport. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened the envelope, and, for a moment, she couldn't process what she was reading. Then, the words sank in. She had been accepted to the United States Air Force Academy. Colonel Rodriguez found her sitting on a bench outside the airport hangar, staring at the letter with tears in her eyes. It was the first time he had ever seen her display such emotion, and it reminded him that despite her maturity and professionalism, she was still a teenager whose biggest dream had just come true. "Congratulations, Sarah," he said, sitting down beside her. "You've earned this opportunity. But, remember, this is just the beginning. The real work starts now." Sarah wiped her eyes and looked up at the sky, where a commercial airliner was leaving a contrail across the blue expanse. Somewhere up there, military pilots were training, serving their country, and pushing the boundaries of what was possible in aviation. Soon, she would be joining their ranks. Her grandmother had been right to call her little bird, but Sarah was ready to spread her wings and fly higher than anyone had ever imagined possible. The chicken coop was far behind her now, and the sky ahead was limitless.